Russia's war in Ukraine has gone on for over 34 months, and today we want to review the military situation. I'm Julian Rebke, and this is BILD Situation Room. We begin in western Russia, in Smolensk. There was another Ukrainian drone attack there last night. The aircraft factory in the city was hit, which is officially called an aircraft factory, but actually produced Kh-55 and Kh-59 cruise missiles for the Russian military. We are looking at the footage from Smolensk from this morning, and we see at the beginning how one of the Ukrainian drones, just before impact, here we saw it, I'm trying to pause it again, right at the moment it flies directly over the people, and shortly after that, there we see it. Strikes at the facility in Smolensk. Here we clearly observe this drone, which, contrary to the Russian army's claims, was not shot down beforehand. They claimed that every single drone was completely shot down, and supposedly only a few of the smaller fragments inadvertently hit something. However, as we can clearly observe in these shots, the drones indeed hit directly, striking their intended targets instantaneously. That was one of the drones that struck here. We'll soon see a fire in this factory, which, as mentioned, was producing cruise missiles for the Russian army. We also have other recordings now, photos showing that part of the factory was only damaged and destroyed while a large part is still in use. Here we have additional footage from residents in Smolensk filmed during the night, and it might remind us somewhat of the scenes from a few months ago in Kharkiv, where the TV tower was destroyed by Russian missiles. We can try to orient ourselves here behind this Ferris wheel. There's also a TV tower or telecommunication tower visible, and we can see another now. Ukrainian drone impact right here in this tower. That means once again, with pinpoint accuracy, Ukrainian kamikaze drones managed to strike here in Smolensk. We have additional footage that shows how the Russian air defense became very active. It was reportedly involving Pantsir S-1 vehicles. At first we observe footage captured by someone at home, and that's genuinely quite frightening because we can clearly see that the Pantsir S-1 was placed relatively high, probably on a building or an elevation, and that the rocket is about to launch and narrowly misses but then hits a part of the city. And we've observed this from multiple perspectives. The Russians have become increasingly active. They have possibly also, at least it looks like, shot down some of the Ukrainian drones. However, the Ukrainians first had enough drones with which they attacked. Secondly, and unfortunately we'll see this shortly, some of the Russian anti-aircraft missiles have apparently also hit the infrastructure in the city, including residential buildings. We observe another missile launch happening here near the airport. This is also a Russian anti-aircraft missile that is now advancing towards a drone. Here, supposedly a drone was hit. According to our research, that could be the case. Some claimed you could directly see a house hit here, but that's not true as there are no high-rises in this area. Regardless, due to the outcome of this entire back and forth involving drone attacks and the anti-aircraft missiles that were launched in response, we then ended up with damage to numerous residential buildings that caught fire. However, it's questionable whether those were really Ukrainian drones, because we've seen Ukrainian drones which were filmed by Russian people here. They all hit where they were supposed to, namely in either the critical infrastructures of the city of Smolensk or directly in military facilities, where the Russian cruise missiles, which have been fired at Ukraine for almost 3 years, are also being built. Let's take a look at some more footage, not only from Smolensk today, but also from the past few days from the city of Saratov. Another significant attack happened in this area. Saratov, as we remember, is a city situated in the central region of Russia near to the Engels Air Base, which is operated by the Russian Air Force. And that's why this city is extremely important for the Russian army. We see this large fire from one of the tanks, from one of the fuel tanks at the airport, and we also have more footage coming up. See how the firefighters battled this blaze. And if we internalize these recordings from the past few days, we realize that at the latest, since the beginning of the year, the Ukrainian army has been conducting a massive campaign, namely critical targets. Here we now see how the firefighters are trying to battle this massive fire there to attack critical targets within Russia. And we have internalized this on our own build infographic, so to speak, and want to take a look at how and what exactly the Ukrainian army has been doing there in the last 21 days. Since the beginning of the year, exactly targeted it. We look at the map, see the front line here within Ukraine once again, but now let's zoom out a bit and see how massive, how large Russia, of course, is. We remember Ukraine is 2.5 times the size of Germany. And now we can clearly observe the targets that were attacked. We have a variety of targets directly indicated, of course, with these small explosion visuals depicted here. That means Smolensk was attacked last night. Here we see it as just one of the cities. However, we had attacks that were more than 1,000 kilometers away from Ukraine. For instance, up here, Ostluga, a loading port of the Russian merchant navy, from where, quite naturally, Gas used to be transported towards Germany, but also in Nizhny and Kazan. And we just observed Saratov, that was indeed the airport that was attacked over there. This signifies that we are witnessing Ukrainian drone attacks actively targeting the border regions at this moment. We have Belgorod, we have Kursk, we have Smolensk, and also, of course, we have cities like Bryansk and Voronezh, basically all the oblasts that are bordering Ukraine or situated very nearby. In the south, of course, also with Rostov. However, we also have some Ukrainian attacks that, since the beginning of the year, just in the last 21 days alone, have gone significantly further beyond that. And when we look at the targets, we see that there were a total of 10 military infrastructures that were attacked. For instance, the military airport situated in Saratov, or that particular factory we have just viewed in Smolensk, as well as another dedicated repair facility for the Tu-160 bombers in Kazan that was attacked, which we just saw earlier. However, we also have various oil infrastructures that were attacked. This means it's also aimed at the Russian fuel supply. On one hand, the fuel supply for the war, and on the other, for the general population. In that sense, it's a double effect that Ukraine is trying to achieve in Russia by, making people somewhat tired of the war, by saying, if you continue to wage war in our country, and you clearly are, as you can see on this map, we will keep showing you that this won't go without consequences for all Russians who are just looking to live a normal life. Additionally, we had 2 trade infrastructures, one we showcased in Ust-Luga and a second one, both of which were attacked recently, exactly within the last 3 weeks. This means that we see that Ukraine is no longer taking it lying down, but has in a way also changed its strategy a bit. We know, and unfortunately we'll see this again in the latest images, that in parts of the country they are indeed at a disadvantage, especially numerically. There are far fewer soldiers than the Russians have. However, when it comes to the kamikaze drones, and we must not forget, these are mostly Ukrainian drones, such as those we saw, for example, of the Lyuty type and others, which are specifically built in Ukraine and then used. As for these drones, there is now at least a balance with Russia, who have their Geran 1 and Geran 2 kamikaze drones originally produced in Iran but now manufactured in Russia. And when it comes to other weaponry, there isn't this kind of superiority yet, as in the case of cruise missiles, where Russia is ahead with the Kh-55, Kh-59, Kh-101 still considering, but Ukraine is currently in the process of building their own cruise missiles, which, however, are only to be deployed once a sufficiently large number has been reached to use it sustainably over and over again. In addition, there are a few Storm Shadow cruise missiles from the United Kingdom, Scalp EG from France, and unfortunately not Taurus from Germany at all. If they were to arrive in substantial numbers, it would naturally have an even more significant and pronounced effect. Nevertheless, Ukraine is working on it, and the interesting thing is to note that even though the war has been going on for so long, and Ukraine is of course worn down and partly war-weary, when it comes to their weapons production, their armaments industry, they're not there at all. One eventually becoming thoroughly worn out and producing less and less, but rather quite the opposite. The Ukrainian defense industry is steadily ramping up its operations and is progressively advancing even closer to surpassing the Russian war industry. We move from the center of Russia all the way to the western part, focusing our attention closely on the Kursk region. Yesterday was the inauguration of Donald Trump. Putin had said that Kursk must be recaptured at any cost. It absolutely must not become a bargaining chip, and for that reason, we now have new revealing footage of the attempts, the Russian efforts, to reclaim Kursk, which have ultimately all miserably failed. We're reviewing the most recent footage and observe, yet again, that a significant number of Russian military units were actively engaged and deployed to get closer to the Ukrainian defensive line here, but all of those units were ultimately destroyed in the process. And that's quite interesting when we look at it. These 4 tanks and armored personnel carriers in the middle here are currently moving towards the Ukrainian lines. On the left and the right, we can already observe the wrecks from other previous attempts, all of which ended in failure and resulted in absolute Russian massacres in that particular area. Yet the Russians persist. We're seeing it very close up now. It's quite an unusual tactic, likely intended to avoid running into the mines as much as possible. Nevertheless, we can see here that in this case, the kamikaze drones of the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian army keep striking this specific location, and we observe extremely devastating and catastrophic explosions at certain times where the Russian vehicles are completely obliterated, together with all the crew members who are on board. We can clearly observe the Russians consistently making efforts, as usual, to reach these tree ridges in order to establish a strategic foothold where they intend to deploy their infantry effectively. However, we also observe that only a few of the vehicles actually manage to reach there, while others are unfortunately destroyed earlier. Quite a variety of armored vehicles we have here, where we can clearly observe that while they are deployed by Russia, they are nevertheless mostly destroyed in the process. And it is indeed interesting and strange to see how Russia keeps doing the same thing over and over again. There's no other tactic, no alternative to what is being done in this context. Of course, they maintain air superiority, which is strategically used for both the large bombers and the fighter jets. Additionally, they repeatedly use the same tactics, widely referred to by the Ukrainians as meat assaults. That means you approach the opponent head-on, go directly in there, and here we see another T-80 tank of the Russian army in very interesting camouflage, which has probably been prepared for winter now. But the snow has now melted here in Kursk, and we can clearly see that this entire attack has completely failed miserably, and therefore another small part of Kursk, namely approximately 400 square kilometers, remaining under Ukrainian control. Let's closely look at the map to understand the situation better and notice how Russia is trying hard to change the battle dynamics in Kursk. In recent days, Ukraine has made advances south of Sucha, showcasing their determination and resilience in the ongoing situation. In this sector of the region, the Russians were fairly nearby, roughly 2 kilometers away from Sucha. We see the Ukrainians have returned there. Currently, they are about 4 to 5 kilometers away from Sucha, and what we just saw were strong Russian attacks in this direction. That means they're trying from all directions except from the southwest here, which is also possible, this area of Kursk, which is still under Ukrainian control, to attack. Nevertheless, we just saw that the entire attack was also repelled here, and they still haven't managed to recapture Malaya Lochna here in the north, let alone Sucha, and Sucha would really be the final battle, so to speak, if you had defeated everything else and regained it. It would then be about Sucha to then here to finally drive the Ukrainians out of Russia. That is still a thing of the future that the Russian Federation has to this day. Despite this massive deployment of hundreds of our own tanks, which we have just seen, yes, the 4 current ones, so at least 8 destroyed ones we just saw, and also thousands of soldiers from North Korea. Despite their efforts, the Russian army still hasn't managed to successfully recapture this region of Kursk. Elsewhere, in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donetsk, the situation seems quite different. In various other locations, particularly in the eastern Ukrainian region called Donetsk, the situation is quite different from that observed in several other regions. And in that region, paradoxically, Russia is also deploying much stronger military forces, specifically a significant portion of its army that is strategically planned to be utilized for the planned conquest of Ukraine. We have obtained new footage from the small town of Kotlin, and this footage reveals fresh evidence produced by the Russian army. Here we can observe Russian soldiers on the move, with industrial buildings in the region having been captured by the Russian army forces, where the Russians have been suspected so far, but there was no evidence. Here we see again, these are Ukrainian recordings, of course, they still have kamikaze drones. They're still trying to weaken the Russian army as much as possible by attacking each individual soldier as soon as they're spotted using those kamikaze drones. Nevertheless, these recordings from Kotlin, and we'll look at this on the map in a moment, show us that the Russian army has now even bypassed the major city of Pokrovsk and is now approaching from the west, namely approaching from the southwest of the city, which once had 65,000 inhabitants, to encircle it and, as we've seen before, to launch a flanking attack from multiple directions simultaneously. As mentioned, the recordings clearly demonstrate to us that Kotlin is now under Russian control, and we take a look at this small town and observe that it lies west of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, this large city we've been closely watching for months because the Russians have been trying to attack here. Already about 4 months ago, they were directly standing in the east of the city, but couldn't advance further and then executed this massive flank attack in the south here. And now we have just seen the footage from Kotlin right up here, and we can see that Pokrovsk is being threatened from the west, as well as it is just as important that the E50 highway is endangered. This is the significant main highway that leads towards Dnipro, heading towards central Ukraine, and it is also facing a potential threat in that area, because we just saw that a portion of the Russian soldiers could indeed be killed there. Nevertheless, if even just a single FPV drone team manages to survive and establish itself there in one of these industrial buildings, then you're left only with, as you can see pretty clearly, only approximately 6 kilometers to get to the E50. This is literally a task that these small kamikaze drones can effortlessly manage. And therefore, we can already assume that the main supply route from Pokrovsk, specifically coming from the direction of Dnipro, is currently already under threat and possibly even being partially monitored by Russia, likely using FPV drones. And the fate that Ukraine is trying to spare Pokrovsk has already befallen Toretsk, just a few kilometers away. We are looking at new footage from the city that confirms what we've already heard from some Ukrainian channels, namely that there's still a small mine controlled approximately 5% of the city's entire area. We know that these are mainly mining towns in the eastern region of Ukraine. And this one mine is now being attacked by a single Ukrainian tank, which is trying to drive out the Russians. But that too is, of course, a strategy. You can already see that, which probably won't work out because there are no infantrymen involved. That means the tank is attempting to target individual Russian soldiers who are currently hiding in this mine situated on the northern edge of Toretsk. trying to kill individual soldiers here with his main weapon and probably also with the machine guns. However, we don't see any counterattack from the Ukrainians. That means we don't see any efforts to have infantry reclaim this mine and bring it back under their control. That means we're observing the same pattern that has been seen repeatedly over recent months. Yes, many Russian soldiers are being killed, sometimes 70, 80, 90% of the attacking troops. Nevertheless, the remaining 10% continue to hold out until they receive reinforcements, which then come back in again. Starting from there, it generally progresses westward, which eventually led to the successful capture and control of nearly all parts of Donetsk. Let's take a quick look at the map, see the scene we just experienced as mentioned in the far north of the city. So we see the city area in gray, and the red is firmly under Russian control. The orange has just been captured by Russia, and what we just saw was scenes from this area. That means those were actually the very last buildings in this town of 30,000 inhabitants that were still at least contested, where at least the Ukrainian forces are still nearby, frequently returning and trying persistently to defend the area against the Russian troops there. But we see it on the map, also on the road map, you can see it quite clearly. The vast majority, 95% of Donetsk, is now under Russian control. And we'll stay briefly in the Donetsk region, and we have another video here showing us how fiercely the Russians are trying at all costs to bring additional soldiers into the contested villages. This is basically a prime example, if you will, of a Russian landing that we are witnessing here, as well as the Ukrainian defense. In this scene, we have the opportunity to observe that in total, if I'm correct, 5 BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles are steadily making their approach towards a small settlement that is located near Terny in the region of Donetsk. We see that one of these fighting vehicles here is already neutralized. We'll see in a moment how soldiers jump out. That means it was recently moving but has already been hit by a drone. And the other 4 soldiers then continue to approach the devastated village. I believe you can now see it quite clearly. Now the first soldiers jump out here. Focus briefly on this tiny spot. There you can see it, how a number of soldiers exit the armored personnel carrier and subsequently have to run the final 100 meters or so to reach the edge of the village. The other armored infantry vehicles are doing what they always do. Their task is to prepare this landing. That means they each have maybe 5 to 10 infantrymen on board and are trying to deploy them as quickly as possible and then retreat, since the actual combat is supposed to be carried out by the infantry. This means that after the brief fire support from the main guns of these BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, the soldiers are on their own. We are observing how nearly all the tanks have now gathered here, and this is apparent from the visible tracks as they are consistently driving in circles around the area. That means you drive directly up to the location, go over here, quickly drop off the soldiers, and then attempt to retreat back towards the east as swiftly as possible to avoid Ukrainian drones. However, the Ukrainians observed the situation, and now we see it from various perspectives, not just this drone, but the identical scene from the viewpoint of the killer drones being deployed and now consecutively attacking this BMP-2 vehicle here. And it's always a double-edged sword, because on one hand we obviously observe that 2 or even 3 out of the total of 5 armored vehicles are being effectively destroyed in this situation. That would at least stop them at that moment. They can't continue and can then be intercepted by further overnight attacks and so on and being destroyed. We see here how it keeps hitting, in this case right next to the houses. However, it must be clearly stated, for the Russians, this is still a relatively successful mission, because their mission wasn't for these infantry fighting vehicles to survive or for the crew inside to survive. But the mission was to successfully carry out these landings, while at the moment we can observe several deceased Russian soldiers, albeit pixelated. That means the mission was to deploy the soldiers, drop off the entire infantry, and then, depending on the circumstances encountered, either retreat to safety or face possible destruction. The Russian generals don't really care much, because it was just about moving the infantry further westward so that they can then fight and engage in combat in that village. And we saw this, there were just 5. That means we're talking about 25 to 50 infantrymen, which is probably 3, 4, 5 times more than the Ukrainians have defenders here in this place. In that sense, a difficult situation. On one hand, we see the Russian strategy, which is somehow working. On the other hand, the Ukrainian strategy is also working. The strategy involves making efforts to destroy as much as reasonably possible, targeting both the deployed mechanized equipment and the infantry being utilized, and then to gradually and carefully retreat backwards in a systematically calculated manner, while the Russian forces, experiencing extremely heavy losses and simultaneously having their war economy in Russia heavily bombarded, persist in advancing further to new positions in the east of Ukraine. We move from the ground battle somewhat to the battle in the air, that is the fight for Ukraine's airspace, and we have various videos from the south of the country showing us how both Russian bombers on one side and Ukrainian fighter jets on the other are trying to, each utilizing their air-based weapon systems to impact the adversary forcefully. We begin in the city of Huliaipol, located in the Zaporizhia region, and observe here from a surveillance drone of the Russian army demonstrating how an attack is being carried out on this city. And the interesting thing is, when you look at these entire recordings, you obviously see that 2 by 2 kilometers or 3 by 3 kilometers are shown here. This implies that the Russians are uncertain about the exact location where their bombs will strike and are merely hoping that they capture the correct target area of this particular Ukrainian city on film. And we'll see this shortly in the impacts. One of them, the very first, actually ends up landing on a street. Actually, the second bomb, we see that about 50 meters beside it, and that's not visible at all. That means the Russians only zoom in once they see, okay, we've hit the target. That's quite good. Maybe those were Ukrainian soldiers or civilians or whoever. In any case, it's just in the mass, when you have so many bombs, a relatively effective way. Now, we've observed that, just to recap briefly, 4 bombs in total actually hit here. And we observed that 2 bombs missed their targets while 2 approximately hit the streets. We can also see this scenario from various perspectives. Of course, the Russians are monitoring that with multiple drones. Nevertheless, the effect that this sheer mass of bombs has, and we are talking about around 1,200 glide bombs per month, he is very focused on the Ukrainian army and such, so that in the end, military positions are often hit as well. Now, we see another attack, here too. The Crown isn't sure what's happening. We see here again the first impact right in the middle of nowhere. This means nothing was hit at all. The shockwave most likely won't even have the capacity to cause any significant damage. However, the second impact, as we are observing it while the smoke from the bomb continues to rise into the sky, is directly visible on this particular intersection up here, or at the very least, somewhere near the intersection. This means that here we likely have 2 FAB 500 bombs being used, one of which hits the target, while the other completely misses. The Russians can do that. They can afford it because they have so many of these bombs that they can use daily. With Ukraine, it's a different situation. Let's look at that now. For one thing, unlike the Russian ones, Ukrainian aircraft can't fly at a height of 10 kilometers because there are so many Russian air defense systems and very few Ukrainian ones. Unfortunately, I'm afraid one has to admit this. Instead, Ukraine must approach the designated location at a quite low altitude. Let's take a detailed look now. Here, we can see a Ukrainian MiG-29 type fighter jet. And this aircraft maneuvers at a very notably low altitude over the region of Kherson before ascending quickly in order to deploy and release its glide bomb effectively, to release the French AASM 250 hammer bomb. At this moment, we can observe this distinct parabola being flown here. It goes up very steeply. Then the bomb is dropped at the last moment. The airplane swiftly flies back to its safe and lower altitude, ensuring that it remains securely within a protected flight zone for optimal safety. The Ukrainians approach it differently than the Russians. They now view a higher, larger section. But you know exactly, the bomb is supposed to hit here. That's why there's a cross on it. Because this is a former boat rental, which is now likely being used by the Russians near the Dnipro, here in the Kherson region, as a sort of naval base. Yes, an inland naval base. And we can see clearly now how the person filming this knows precisely where to place their focus. And right at that spot, yes, we can also observe it here, the French precision bomb makes its powerful impact immediately, which is also a glide bomb, comparable to the Russian ones, albeit offering significantly higher accuracy. So we can see these big impacts here now. We see that it's hitting exactly the house we wanted to target. Looking at the observed destructive power, one can quite clearly see that a direct hit on a large building, like the one we see here, results in significant and extensive damage. In other words, both sides, of course, continue to have an air force in action. One side continues to focus on quantity, but it's notable that the FAB 500s have improved in accuracy and are now regarded as precision bombs. The other air force needs to make sure that every single MiG-29 they are operating does not get shot down, and that every single shot they take is a direct hit, which is why they must focus on precision and have trust and confidence in their capabilities. That in this case, the target here in Kherson is hit precisely. Let's take a quick look at the map and see that both targets we just looked at are relatively close to their respective fronts. Juliaipol isn't exactly marked here, but I can show it. The city is about here, so also only about 20 kilometers behind the front. That's roughly this range. The Russian glide, that's about 40-50 kilometers. But let's not forget that the Russians do not fly over Ukrainian airspace, but rather release their bomb from about here and then let it fall there. In the Ukrainian attack we just saw, it was a bit different. The target was even closer, namely here in Oleshki, a city occupied by Russia since 2022. And accordingly, the Ukrainian MiG-29 then flew approximately from this location, released the bomb, firmly trusting its sophisticated mechanism to precisely guide it accurately to the intended target very effectively. But what we clearly see regarding these glide bombs is that it's really not many kilometers. Both sides may have the potential to strike up to 50 kilometers behind the front lines, but they can't go much farther than that distance. Anything beyond that has to be done by Ukrainian kamikaze drones or Russian cruise missiles, as we saw earlier.